Today I'm going to do a lot of meal prepping for my husband, and as you might know, in the month of January and February we are not shopping at all for food. So I'm using a lot of what I have in my freezers or in the garden and pantry and so on. So right now I'm just finding all of the stuff that I'm going to use for his meal prep. And here I have some cubed pumpkin, some cubed squash and shredded squash. I have a lot of cream and some pork tenderloins. These are some chicken fillets from my own chickens. And I have some minced meat and some sausages and some fat from a beef we bought and some bone broth and so on. So I always take it out of the freezer a few days before I'm going to use it, and then I'm just putting it into our fridge so it can thaw out slowly, and then it's ready for use. And this is my pantry, and I put all of the veggies in here so they can really thaw out and lose all of the extra moisture. So this is 1 or 2 days later. And these are some of my fresh veggies that I still have from the garden, so I'm going to use some of those as well. These are kohlrabis. So I'm just going shopping in my own pantry for all of these veggies. I have some of the zucchini and the kohlrabis, and I also have some rutabagas that I'm using. And these are not my own onions because the harvest failed totally last year, but I hope this year it will be better. So I'm just taking some of these onions that I'm going to use as well. And this is the day before the actual meal prep. So I'm going to prep a lot of the fresh veggies this day. That makes it a lot easier for the day that I'm doing all of the rest of the stuff. So I'm just removing the seeds and I'm going to chop them into smaller pieces. And then I'm going to put some salt on them to draw out some of the moisture. And this is a really fun zucchini. It has grown in my raised bed where there are sides on, so it couldn't grow any further and just curled around itself. And I'm not using a lot of salt, but I'm trying to put it on every layer so that it can really draw out some of the moisture, and then the dishes won't get so soggy. And this is one of the kohlrabis, and even though it has a bad spot, you can just cut it off and then use the rest. And it's really nice to have all of these fresh veggies in January still. So I'm just doing the same with these ones, cutting them out into smaller pieces and salting them a little. And this is one of the rutabagas. We had some really big ones, so this is actually a small one even though it's still big. And then all of the onions, I'm cutting them up into smaller pieces and putting them into this pan so I can just use a little in each dish I'm going to make. And I'm doing the same with the garlic in a moment. Just makes the actual meal prep so much easier when I have all of my veggies prepped before, and also all of the onions and garlic, because as you can see there are a lot of small pieces that I have to remove and chop up. So that's really nice, and that makes the actual meal prep day so much easier and not so stressful because I'm doing a lot of meals this day. So this is just all of the veggies prepped and ready to go for the next day. and I'm putting them out in my pantry where it's colder, so they can just sit there until I need them. And this is the same day I'm going to prep some of the tenderloins from the pork, because I'm putting it into my slow cooker, and then they can just get really soft and tender during the night, and then the next day I can do some more with it. This is just some drippings from another dish that I made, and this is mustard seeds, and I also put in some of the frozen broth, and this is mustard, so it's kind of a mustard sauce that I'm making. And some of the onions and the garlic, and I'm just turning it around in the pot so it gets nice and coated everywhere. And then I'm putting in some salt and some pepper, and this is where the next day, where it has set all the night on low, and it's really tender now. Now I'm going to put in some of the veggies. These are just some mushrooms that I had in some cans. We don't have any fresh mushrooms right now because of the pantry challenge. And this is some of the cream that I also had in my freezer, and it's really good to cook with. You can also use it in coffee, but it will separate a little when it has been frozen. And this is the rutabaga. And now I'm on to the next dish, and this is all of the kohlrabi and some of the rutabaga that I put into this pot. And first off, I'm going to boil it. And this is for yet another dish where I'm using all of these sausages and some of all of this zucchini that I cut up yesterday. And I'm also using the pumpkin from the freezer. And you can see how much it has thawed, and all of the extra moisture I can drain off, and that means that the dish won't get as soggy as it would have else. And I'm just placing all of the pumpkin on top of each tray, and some of the onions and garlic. And I'm putting on some salt, some pepper, some steak seasoning, and I'm putting on some small pieces of butter so it can melt into the dish when it's getting into the oven. And this is the kohlrabi that is almost finished with the boil. Then I'm going to drain it. And these are for the meatballs. I'm doing two kinds of meatballs, and these are some onion tops that I also had in my freezer. And then I have some spices and some of the garlic, and I'm going to use my mixer to mix it. But the meat was still a little frozen, so I had to wait a little to mix it really nice. This is a little room that I have beside my other pantry where I have some of my canned stuff. I'm going to use some of these tomatoes also to make a tomato sauce for the meatballs. Now I'm going to drain the kohlrabi so I can get on with that dish as well. And I'm going to stew it with cream and butter. So I'm just putting the pot back onto the stove, and I'm using a big blob of butter. And I'm going to melt it, and then put in some cream and some spices as well. And I'm using some salt and some pepper and some nutmeg. And that is pretty much all of the spices that are going into this dish. I also use some xanthan gum to thicken it up, and that helps a lot when you're not using any flour or cornstarch or anything like that. So I'm going to give it a boil so it will thicken, and you can already see how it thickens because of the xanthan gum. And when it's a nice consistency, I'm putting in the kohlrabi again and just giving it a quick boil. And then it's finished, and I can place it in my meal prep containers. And I will also put in some meatballs that we in Denmark call frikadeller. It's not a typical meatball, but it's made out of minced pork. And this is all of the sausages and squash and pumpkin that I'm putting into the oven. And while I did all of the other things, this meat has thawed, so I can mix it in my mixer now, and then I'm going to make it into frikadeller. And I'm going to use a silicone mold to do it, so it will get a lot easier. I also just put in an egg and some shredded zucchini that I pulled out of the freezer the other day. And I'm using some of these potato fibers called po fiber. There are almost none carbs in it because I'm using so little of it. And this is the silicone mold that I'm going to use, so I can make them into the same shape and size. That makes it a lot easier. And now I'm going to make the regular meatballs, and this is a mix of pork and beef, minced meat, and then some of my homemade seasoning salt with herbs from my garden and some of the onion tops. And this is homemade chipotle and some herb de Provence and some extra oregano and some basil and pepper and some onion powder and garlic granules. Then I'm just going to mix it like the other batch. And I'm also putting these into silicone molds and baking them in the oven, so it makes it a lot easier, and it's also an easy cleanup. Now I'm going to start to make the tomato sauce for the meatballs. So I'm putting in some of the onions and the garlic. This is some beef fat from when I made the bone broth. I just froze it and then I can use it now. This is some chicken bone broth that I also made from my own chickens. And I have some pumpkin puree that I also pulled out of the freezer, also made out of our own pumpkins, of course. And this is some homemade tomato ketchup. And just putting in the rest of this to give it another taste. And then the tomato can that I pulled out of the little room. This is some tomato chutney. So you can see I just have a lot of leftovers that I'm putting into this sauce. And I have some of kind of cowboy candy that I made out of our chilies that I'm putting in. And I also have this little thing of tomato paste or passata that I'm using. And then all of the spices. This is just some pepper and some of the herbs de Provence, some oregano, and I'm just stirring it around, and then I'm letting it come up to a boil and letting it thicken a little. This is the rest of the shredded zucchini that I have in the freezer. So it will just become a really nice tomato sauce, all of these things. Now I'm on to another dish. This is all homemade bacon, home smoked and everything. And I'm going to make a chicken dish with this one. I'm just going to cut up the bacon into smaller pieces and put them in a pan with some of the onions and garlic and some oil, and then frying it up. And I also had some of the onion tops from last year, so I'm going to put them in the dish as well. And I have a little rest of this Turkish yogurt that I'm putting in. And then the spices, this is some paprika. And I'm not really measuring anything, I'm just putting it in. This is some smoked paprika, some pepper, salt, and then I'm stirring it and letting it heat up. And I have some cream cheese that I'm putting in, some cream, and this is some of the bone broth. And this will become a really nice sauce. And I'm also putting in some cumin and some xanthan gum to thicken it up. Later on it will go into the oven, and sometimes it can get runny if you don't use a thickener like xanthan gum. Now I'm cutting up some cheese for the dish with the sausages and the zucchini and pumpkin, and this will go on top when it gets out of the oven, so it can just melt into everything. And this is back to the bacon sauce, and I'm putting in some of those cubed zucchini that I also pulled out of the freezer, because else I don't have that many vegetables in this dish. So this is the sausage dish that I pulled out of the oven, and I'm putting the cheese on top. These are the meatballs and the fricadella inside of the oven. Now I'm on to preparing my chicken, and this is all chicken that we have grown ourselves last year. And I'm just keeping the skins on because my husband likes it like that. I'm putting it into this big dish and salting it with my homemade herb salt. And then I'm putting the bacon sauce on top. And then some shredded cheese on top. Now I'm on to my second chicken dish, and I'll start it the same way with the onions and the garlic. And now I'm cutting up the chicken and putting it into this dish as well, so it's ready for when the sauce is. And I'm using some of the broth in this sauce as well. and some cream. And some cream cheese. I'm just using whatever I have in my fridge, and I happen to have some of these, so that's what's going into the dish. And this is mozzarella that I also just had in my fridge, so I'm going to crumble that up. And this is the first chicken dish that I put into the oven, and when the second one is ready I'll put that in as well. This is some frozen spinach that I had thawed out from the day before and drained, so it's not too liquidy, and that's just going into the sauce as well. I also put some xanthan gum into this and some spices, and now I'm just putting it onto the chicken, and it will almost flow over because there's so much, but it just worked out fine. And on top of this I'll also put some cheese, and then it will go into the oven. And then back to the meatballs. These are the fricadella that I'm putting onto the kohlrabi that were stewed in butter and cream. And then this dish is actually finished. So these are the 2 chicken dishes in the oven. This is the tenderloin with the mustard sauce that I started yesterday. And now all of the veggies are tender as well, so I can also put these into the meal prep boxes, and this dish is also finished now. And the other meatballs are also finished, so I'm putting these into these boxes, and I will put the tomato sauce on top. So this is how the tomato sauce looks now, and it's really good and tasty and really thick. And I'm also going to put some sauerkraut on top that I made this summer. And I'm going to bake some egg white bread that he will also get the days that he will eat these meals. So he can dip it into the sauce, because there are only those 2 meatballs in every one of them. This is the first chicken dish with the bacon sauce, and this is the second one where the spinach is in, and they look really good. So this is the tomato sauce and the meatballs with the egg white breads on top, so I'll just freeze it all like this. And this is the sausage dish that I just put everything onto one dish so I can mix it around, and then distributed them into some boxes. And this is how they look. Really colorful and tasty. And now I'm going to put the chicken dishes into some meal prep boxes, but it's really important to let them cool a little before, because even though they are not as runny, it is still a little hard to get everything into the right box if you don't let it cool a little before. But these turned out really good. And I have some homemade coleslaw that I have canned. I'm just using the rest of this jar into the dishes, and And this is the second chicken dish with the spinach sauce. And I'm also putting on some sauerkraut on this one, so it will get a little more veggies and not just the spinach and the onions that's inside the dish. And this is how they look. They're really colorful and tasty and delicious and filling. And this is all of the meals. I made 36 meals for the freezer, and then we ate some of the tenderloin and the mustard sauce this evening, so 38 meals all in all. And this is in the freezer where I put a lot of the meals in. So my husband will have food for at least a few months because he'll only use about 4 boxes each week. But thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. And I also hope that you want to subscribe to the channel so you can get notifications when the next video comes out. Bye!